Thank you for tuning into the Short Stacks. I'm Lisa Quintero, young adult librarian.
And I am Nick Barron, patron and sometimes volunteer.
This is a show where we talk to you about what we've been reading, listening to, or watching. And this week we're going to be talking a bit about some books we've been reading about hip-hop and music in general. But first, some
library news.
There's not much to report this week. We are still signing people up for summer reading, so if you have a child between a infant or an 18-year-old, anywhere in that range, you can sign them up for the summer reading program. And other than that, the podcast is going to be switching to a bi-weekly format starting this month. So we will be on this week, but we won't be on next week, and it'll go back and forth like that in order to make time to do other things at the library as well.
From the stacks.
So what did you read this week, Nick?
This week I read Inside the Terror Dome by Tim Gerson. It is the biography about Public Enemy.
Okay.
And I've got mixed feelings about the book.
Okay.
It's very interesting. I'm a fan of Public Enemy. I would say I'm a big fan of Public Enemy. Mm-hmm. But there are a number of different biographies about the band. Autobiographies and biographies. Mm-hmm. And this particular one, I was grabbing the Beastie Boys book off the shelf and saw it on the shelf at the Shorewood Library, and I was like, "Ooh, a book about Public Enemy! Uh-huh. I'm gonna grab this." And when I originally started reading it, Tim Gerson pointed out right away that one, he's a white author, and two, that he didn't actually interview any of the members of the band. The book is taken from a compilation of or a variety of sources, mostly interviews with the band from
magazines and stuff,
Rolling Stone and places like that, along with reading all of their biographies.
Okay.
So what this book tries to do, and it's very entertaining in what it does. Mm-hmm. It starts off with a chapter on the formation of the band and mm-hmm. how the band came to be, which is a really interesting story. And then each chapter after that is one of their releases, and it breaks down the process, what they were going through at the time that, formed, mm-hmm. How they approach things and the dynamics in the band. And yeah, I as a music fan, I love the minutia mm-hmm. of how a great record came to be. Mm-hmm. And so from that standpoint, I find the book really fascinating. But at the same time, one of the things that I loved about the Beastie Boys book was the fact that because it was written by them now, mm-hmm. Or the surviving members now, is it gave them the opportunity for reflection and mm-hmm. to call themselves out and be like, hey, we did X, Y, and Z, and that was crappy, and we apologize for that. Mm-hmm. And because this is taken from interviews at the time, it only gives things the context of the time.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, one of the great joys of reading this book is, and you may remember this from when you were sitting with me, I was reading the chapter on It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. And there was a reference to something when they were recording Black Steel in the Hour of Chaos, which is one of my favorite songs. And I was so taken by, what was being said that I had to rush into the apartment because I was sitting outside and rush in and listen to the song immediately to be like, oh, that detail, I never picked up on that. And it's so cool. So yeah, it's from that standpoint, if you like the minutia of music, mm-hmm. it's a really interesting book.
Yeah, you said this one was broken down to where each chapter kind of covers an album.
Yeah, correct.
About how many albums have they put out? Do you know?
Let's see. One of the chapters definitely covers 2. Okay. Because they put out 2 records that year. Uh-huh. But yeah, they've put out 12 or 13 records.
Oh well.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a 328-page book before the discography. Okay. And then the discography, they cover 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 records.
Okay. Wow, that's a lot of records.
Yeah, they're prolific.
Yeah. When did they first become a band?
They started in, 80... Yo Bum Rush the Show came out in 1987.
Okay.
So yeah, as far as, they were a little bit later than the first wave of hip hop, mm-hmm. but at the same time, they came into it and had a huge impact right off the bat.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a fascinating book. Yeah, I think the chapter on because the record that spoke the most to me, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. That chapter was extremely interesting, and I followed them through Fear of a Black Planet and Apocalypse 91.
Okay.
And yeah, like it gets into how the band dynamics were working, and I'm gonna tell one more favorite story from this, and then we'll move on to breaking down some of the records and stuff. But my favorite thing that I had no idea, because like the members of Public Enemy, they have cool names like Terminator X and Flava Flav and what have you, and when Chuck D went into forming the band, and he originally didn't even want to form the band. Somebody heard his voice because he did DJing and was on radio and various other things, and he put vocals on one song, and it was something that he thought he was going to do once, and there were people that were like, you need to front a band. And he was like, no. And people like Rick Rubin from Def Jam Records were like, no, he basically called him every day until he managed to convince Chuck D to start a band. And so when he started the band, because he loves rock and roll and he loves punk, and he loves sci-fi, he decided that he wanted a crew like the Star Trek Enterprise.
Okay.
And so each of the people had an in-band backstory that would be delivered into the lyrics.
Okay.
So it's interesting because they, their lyrics have like a very deep political consciousness, but at the same time, they do little flourishes to make each of the characters stand out as they deliver the political conscious aspect.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Because like when I think about bands, like Alice Cooper, and I think about punk bands like the Dead Kennedys. Each member of the band kind of has their own little personality, and they might not actually be like that in real life. But Alice Cooper seems like a very intelligent person in real life, but on the stage he's like sticking his tongue out and doing crazy things. And same with Jello Biafra. He also.
Jello Biafra's just like that.
That's just who he is.
Yes.
But yeah, no, that's interesting. It's interesting where influences come from a variety of types of music, and I'll be talking about that a little bit more when I talk about my books. But yeah, I wouldn't have thought that Public Enemy was influenced by punk and rock, but that's cool.
Yeah, and one of the things that like rock was a huge influence. One of the things that they talk about with It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back is that he loved the fact that rock records were often concept records. And so he had this idea, there's clips throughout the record of a live performance that they did in London, and it was because he wanted it structured and to feel like a live record, even though it was all studio cuts. But they would put these like perfectly timed snippets. And one of the other things, the record at the time, it is so densely layered with samples and clips. They estimated that record had between 100 and 150 samples on it, and Fear of a Black Planet has 150 to 200 samples. Okay. As they went on after that, because it was so dense, they started to move away from that. In fact, when they went into recording Fear of a Black Planet, Chuck D had 100 hours worth of tapes of samples that he had pulled from all different places in order to pull those ideas into songs. And after going to that level of depth, he was like, we're gonna pull back on that a little.
Cool. So if people wanted to listen to some of these Public Enemy records, how could they find them?
Okay, so I looked really quick to see what was on Hoopla and what was in County Cat. And with Public Enemy, I don't remember which was in County Cat. I'll be honest. But on Hoopla, you can get almost every one of the 16 records that are listed in the book. And they definitely have multiple listings for It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, Nation of Millions, Fear of a Black Planet, and Apocalypse 91. All three of those records are top-notch. Highly recommended.
Yeah, and I know that, now that we're more suburban libraries are open, I know that we can request things from other libraries as well. So if there is a Public Enemy record that you would rather have a physical copy of, we can always request it for you from the library, because I'm sure there are several copies of different Public Enemy records within the system. So.
Yep. And one of the other things that I was gonna mention, if you're gonna do the deep dive into Public Enemy, there's one person who also has a baritone voice and a heavy political consciousness similar to Chuck D. And so from that same era, there's a rapper goes by the name of Paris.
Okay.
And he actually, one of the Public Enemy records is a collaboration with him.
Okay.
But I highly recommend the record Sleeping with the Enemy. That was in County Cat.
County Cat. Okay, cool.
So what did you read?
So I read a few graphic novels. The first one that I read is the beginning of a series. It's called Hip Hop Family Tree. And it covers, by Ed Pieskor, who's a well-known graphic novel writer and artist. He covers the years 1970 or the 1970s to the 1981 in this, and so it's basically about the birth of hip hop, and it's a whole series. There's currently 4 books that the library has, Shorewood has, and they go. One of them is the 1970s to 1981, and then we have 1981 to 1983, 1983 to 1984, and 1984 to 1985.
So we wouldn't have even gotten to Public Enemy yet.
So I wouldn't have even gotten to Public Enemy yet. No, so the first one covers the birth of hip-hop, and so for those who don't know, hip-hop basically was born out of parties in New York City, and so there were DJs at these parties who would take different records and mix them together, and, people would come to these parties and hang out. And so among these people were Grandmaster Flash and DJ Kool Herc and Afrika Bambaataa, and they, a couple of them figured new ways of mixing records together and of sampling things, and they kind of, at the time in New York City, there was, the gang culture was pretty intense, and so some of them, like Afrika Bambaataa, wanted to kind of change that dynamic and wanted to stop the violence, and so they tried to get their community together and evolved through the hip-hop movement, and the hip-hop movement included graffiti art, it included emceeing, it included DJing, it included breakdancing, it included a whole variety of arts.
Graffiti, breakdancing. There's 4 pillars of hip-hop.
Yeah. Breakdance, MCs, DJs, and graffiti artists are the 4 pillars of hip-hop. And so Afrika Bambaataa, tried to guide people into doing these things rather than fighting each other. And so this whole concept of rap battles became a thing where, MCs would battle each other. And that was, kind of born out of gang culture, because it's like, instead of, fighting each other with knives and whatnot, they were battling each other with their words. And it was interesting because different neighborhoods like the Bronx and whatnot had their own groups. Mm-hmm. And then, groups from other neighborhoods would come and battle those groups. The graphic novel also covers a blackout that happened in New York City around that time. And that's how a lot of hip hop artists were able to do their thing. A lot of DJs were able to do their thing because a lot of them participated in the looting of electronic stores, and because a lot of DJ equipment, cost thousands of dollars. I mean, at the time it was 1970s, so it'd be, hundreds of dollars, but still very expensive. And if you're just some kid on the street who doesn't have any money and is just trying to do this thing for fun, like, you don't necessarily have hundreds of dollars sitting around. So that's how a lot of them got their equipment. And, from the DJs, a lot of the DJs brought in people to be their MCs to kind of hype up the crowd. And then the MCs, a lot of them started doing, poetry, like, which, is rap. And so among the first few groups that were around, they mention the Treacherous Three, the Cold Crush Brothers, the Funky 4+1, which included the first female MC, and the Fantastic Five. So it covers all of the initial groups, and then it kind of covers, how things started to evolve, with Russell Simmons, becoming involved and starting Run DMC with his brother and some other people that he knew. And so, yeah, it's really interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the series and kind of seeing, how things evolved. It's interesting because a lot of them, talks about how, they wanted to put out their own records, and so they started putting out their own records, but other, there were people who were record label producers who were like, you can't do this because you're taking other people's music and, with copyright and everything, and so they started putting out some of their own stuff because they, big record companies didn't want to put it out because of royalties and things like that, and what they were doing was creating this whole new art form out of other people's music and sampling other people's music, and so that was part of the challenge of hip hop becoming big. Yeah. Was all the sampling that was done. But at the same time, all the sampling that was done has exposed so many people to so many different, musicians, and that segues into my other book that I read, which is another graphic novel, and it is called Monk. It's about Thelonius Monk. It's by Yusef Dawoodi, and it's about the friendship between Thelonius Monk and Kathleen Annie Pananica de Koenigswarter, who is somebody who was a patron of a lot of jazz musicians in New York City during the jazz era. And so she was a aristocrat from Europe. She got really into jazz in the 20s and 30s, and she ended up coming over to the States and helping a lot of jazz artists by getting them gigs and getting, helping them out financially and doing all these things for them, because she just loved jazz music and it made her feel free, and since everybody who made jazz was, black and had all these things going against them, she was like, I want them to be as free as they can to make this music that makes me feel free. And so this is a really interesting book, and Thelonious Monk's actually, he was known as the king of bebop. He pioneered this sound of a lot of discordant notes, and when he first started playing music, a lot of people were like, this is garbage, he sounds like a 5-year-old playing the piano, does he know what he's doing, why is he on stage? And for him, bebop was, he felt the music in him, and he would try to do percussion with one hand on the piano while at the same time doing melodies with the other hand, but he played with very stiff fingers, so it had a very different sound than most normal pianists. And, he was able to prove to people early on that he could play the piano because he had toured with gospel groups and things like that, so he knew how to play the piano, but, in his head, he heard his own music, and the book talks about he listened to a lot of the discordant sounds of the city of New York, and to him that was music, and so even though he received a lot of criticism, he didn't let that stop him, and he just kept doing what he wanted to do, and eventually he got to be very well respected and ended up, doing things with Duke Ellington and other musicians, including Miles Davis, though they, I guess, had a kind of a bit of a feud because different visions in terms of what, the type of jazz that they wanted to create. And so, yeah, because of his way of doing music, he's been sampled in a bunch of different stuff as well. The Wu-Tang Clan has sampled his work. Shaka Khan has sampled his work. Quasimodo, several different artists have sampled his work, which, it's interesting how different musicians from different genres influence each other, and their avant-gardeness kind of inspires other musicians to be like, hey, we're going to do this thing, or, we're going to try to branch out and do this thing that everybody thinks is garbage, but we think it's great. And eventually you find your audience that thinks like, oh, this is great. And so Pananica was the woman, she was a big fan of bebop. She went to a concert of his, and her friend was like, I'm sorry for bringing you to this. This is terrible. And she was like, no, this is amazing. This is not what I was expecting at all. And this man clearly feels free to create his own music. And she actually saw him when he was in Paris. And it's funny because I guess the show that she saw him at was a show that he didn't feel he did very well at, because he was playing with these musicians that was not his band. He had been arrested in the United States prior to going to Paris. And so when he got arrested for possession of marijuana, he ended up in jail, and the cops ended up taking away his cabaret card, which was what allowed him to play at different venues. And so since he wasn't allowed to play venues in the US or in New York City, he ended up, going to Europe to try and play to, get his name out there a bit more. And the people that he played with there didn't really get what he was doing, and they thought he was nuts. And so the show that she went to, he felt was garbage because he did his thing, but the people that he was playing with didn't get what he was trying to do, and were off tempo and were not, doing what he needed them to do. But she still thought he was great, and she had listened to his records before going to the show, and so she knew what he was capable of. And so, she decided to help him out, because she knew that she knew his story and knew what had happened to him in New York. And so she was like, I'll help you get shows and get your name out there back in New York. And yeah, it's interesting, the friendship that she had with him. I guess he was her favorite, according to the author, of all the musicians that she helped, because she helped a lot of people, including Charlie Parker. He actually ended up dying in her flat because I guess he had pneumonia, and a lot of people wouldn't take him in because he was an alcoholic at the time and had kind of, cut ties with a lot of different people in his life. And so she took him in, and he ended up hanging out at her house, or her flat, for a bit, and he died there of pneumonia. And she called the doctor, and they came and took him away, and a lot of people blamed her for his death, but a lot of other people in the community knew that she was the only person who was willing to take him in the state that he was in, and that she was just trying to help. But yeah, she, I guess, faced a lot of scrutiny because she was this white woman who was married to a diplomat who lived in Europe, but she, you know, spent a lot of time in the US, and she would like buy cars for the people that she was helping out, and she would help them out in big ways because she had a lot of money. She was very wealthy. She was part of the Rothschild family in Europe, and they owned banks, and so she, you know, some people thought that there was inappropriate things going on between her and the musicians that she was friends with, but from accounts and things, it sounds like she was just a very generous person, and, you know, she might have had some mental health issues, and it sounds like Thelonious also had some mental health issues because he often would, like, hallucinate things, and that was part of what helped him create his music, is, you know, he saw things and heard things that weren't there, and that, in turn, influenced his music. So I think, you know, they kind of saw a kindred spirit in each other. So yeah, that was really interesting. And I'm excited to read the next 3 volumes of Hip Hop Family Tree. And I'm excited for Ed Piescore to put out some more to see what happens as the 80s progress, you know, see if we make it to Public Enemy and all the other artists that, you know, I remember hearing as a young person. But yeah, I've been listening to a lot of hip hop lately, so felt kind of inspired to look into the history of it because I didn't know a lot about the history of it. I didn't really get into hip hop for real until like the early 2000s, and it was mostly stuff from that era, like Common and you know, Kanye West and things like that. And so KRS-One and
You know, one of the things that when you were talking about Thelonious Monk and like bebop being kind of a deconstruction of jazz and being very dissonant, one of the things that that is really important to recognize is that a lot of times when music moves forward, when it progresses, it's usually when somebody comes along and breaks it down and turns it into something new. Hip hop, when it first came along, it was thought of as a fad. No one in the music industry took it seriously. That's why a lot of the early, the like Beastie Boys and Run DMC and LL Cool J, they were all on Def Jam because it was this small label started by Rick Rubin and Russell Simmons, because none of the bigwigs were willing to
take a chance.
Take a chance. And when Public Enemy made It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, Hank Shockley, he wanted to deconstruct music as well. And so when they went into the studio, there's like air raid sirens and whistles and all of these sounds that you would not associate with music, that you wouldn't associate with music. And it was done deliberately. Like Hank was very, very adamant. You know, somebody would say, you know, that's not music. And Hank would be like, yeah, well, I don't want it to be music. It was in very defiant tone. And, you know, they changed the game.
Yeah. And that's kind of Thelonious Monk, you know, kind of had the same kind of idea. Like, it's not that he didn't want things to be music. His thing was, he was like, I hear music in everything. You know, all the sounds of the world are music. And so he, you know, tried to capture the sounds of the world, the discordant sounds of the world, because to him, that was music. And it's interesting how, you know, different people's views of things can totally change the way that people do things for a while. And then, you know, that in turn influences the next generation of musicians and the next and so on until, you know, you get all these brand new forms of doing things. And it's really inspiring.
Yeah. So on that note, I'm going to talk about one other bit of music, and it ties into all of this. You know, I mentioned that early on, Chuck D came to hip hop, but was a huge fan of punk and rock music. We often associate punk with like suburban white kids.
Yeah. Or like British bands like the Sex Pistols or whatever. Yeah.
Who are then listened to by suburban white kids.
Yes.
But the first, what people consider to be the first hardcore punk band is a band called Bad Brains. And similarly, they took 70s rock riffs, you know, like your hard rock riffs of bands like AC/DC and Black Sabbath and what have you, and they played them all twice as fast. And so you had this, you know, really aggressive buzzsaw sound. And the thing that people would be surprised to know is that, unless punks all know, but people outside of punk don't realize that this band Bad Brains that basically created hardcore punk is 4 black guys from DC, 4 black kids from DC. And it's because they just came in and just turned rock upside down. You know, they came in and they were playing this explosive high energy music, and all of these punk kids from Washington DC area and the surrounding areas were like, "Oh my God."
Yeah. You know, it's really interesting too when you think about it, you know, and I know that it's a frustrating thing to a lot of folks in the Black community, is that how many of our musical movements have come from Black culture originally. You know, it's like when you think about rock and roll, you know, that came from Black culture, from the mix of, you know, like the blues and like R&B and things like that. And, you know, it's funny because like when you think initially my reaction when you said Chuck D was into rock and roll, I'm like, Chuck D is into rock and roll, but then I'm like, why wouldn't Chuck D be into rock and roll? We think about a lot of those things, eventually they get turned into this media that gets consumed by white kids in the suburbs, but you know, a lot of it was originally made by Black folks for Black folks. You know, and eventually it became like jazz, you know, it eventually became a thing that white folks started listening to, but initially it was this thing done by Black folks for Black folks.
Yeah, and one of the things that's that, you know, I think people would have a hard time contextualizing now that are coming at, you know, let's say looking at somebody like Public Enemy from listening to hip hop that's from current times.
Yeah, because like trap music sounds completely different than like...
Yeah, trap music sounds completely different, but even, you know, listening to, you know, like if you listen to Common or Kanye, to think that this band Public Enemy, they, on It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, they reference the New York thrash metal band Anthrax, and in one of the songs there is the backing track is a riff from a song from Slayer.
Okay.
Yeah,
it's just like I remember being really weirded out the first time I heard Run DMC with Aerosmith and the Walk This Way, but then it's like, okay, this works.
Yeah, so since I'm nerding out, so as we said, Def Jam was Russell Simmons, which was one of the members of Run DMC's brother, and Rick Rubin. And Rick Rubin was just like a weird, like if you read the Beastie Boys book, a really weird suburban white kid, that he, you know, came upon this hip hop thing right as it was happening, and Russell Simmons, you know, latched on to Rick Rubin, and they formed Def Jam Records. One of the things that Rick Rubin brought to the table was he really liked the idea of taking classic rock, what we would now call classic rock, and including it in hip hop. And that's why on Licensed to Ill, the first major, or not major, but the first big Beastie Boys record, has a bunch of classic rock riffs. It is that connection that resulted in Run DMC. It was Rick Rubin's idea, if I recall correctly, to reach out to Aerosmith and be like, hey, we want to do this thing. And one of the things that a lot of people don't know, and it was talked about in the Beastie Boys book, and I always thought this as well, Aerosmith was a washed up band. By the time the early 80s hit, you know, their era of songs like Dream On and
yeah, that was all past.
It was all past, and they were a band hanging on by a thread. And then here comes Run DMC, and they end up doing Walk This Way. You know, a cover of Walk This Way with 2 of the members of Aerosmith. And it caused this, it made hip hop accessible to folks that originally wouldn't have listened to hip hop. And at the same time, it jump-started Aerosmith's career again and made the way for Dude Looks Like a Lady. So...
And the songs off of, what was it, Armageddon?
I don't remember.
But I don't want to close my eyes song. I don't want to fall asleep because I miss you, babe.
Yeah. So we can thank Run DMC for
revitalizing Aerosmith.
Yes. But yeah, it was a really big thing, and you know, part of the reason why that Slayer riff is on Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, such a long title, is because of the fact that Slayer was on Def Jam, and which you think of Def Jam, you think hip hop label. Oh, this is LL Cool J, this is Run DMC, this is Public Enemy, and Slayer. So, but yeah, so you know, that connection allowed that to happen. There's also, if you want to get a look at books on like photography of hip-hop artists and rock musicians from that time, look for a photographer named Glennie Friedman. He was a really prolific photographer in that era, and there is a ton of fantastic photos capturing that era of hip-hop and punk rock. And there's even a classic photo of Chuck D and Flavor Flav wearing Minor Threat shirts.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, the intersections between punk and hip hop, there seem to be quite a few, because it's like also I remember reading in the graphic novel the hip hop family tree about Debbie Harry, and how it's like her music, it was influenced by she came from like the punk movement, but then like her music was kind of disco influenced in the same time, and so but then she had a few songs where she kind of rapped the lyrics instead of sang them, because she was, influenced by everything else that was happening in New York City at the time. Yeah.
That was the thing, is that both of those things were urban music, and so like it was normal when I listened to the punk radio show in Buffalo, New York on WBNY, which was a
college radio.
Yeah, college radio. There was always every 2-hour block they would do like a run of hip-hop tracks, at least in 1989.
So if you want to learn more about hip-hop, or just, jazz, or the influences of hip-hop and how hip-hop came to be, check out these books at the library. We have them all at the Shorewood Library, and then we also have the music available. Either you can, like I said, if it's not available at our library, you can request it and we can get it from another library, or a lot of it is available on Hoopla, so you can listen to it on Hoopla. As always, thank you for tuning into the Shorewood Stacks. We hope you have enjoyed the show. You can find us on iTunes, Spotify, or Podbean, which has an app that you can put on your phone as well. And like I said, we won't be here next week, but we will be back the third week of July. So tune in then to find out what we've been listening to, reading, or watching. Until next time, thanks for listening, and be well. The Shorewood Stacks is produced by Lisa Quintero and Nick Barron for the Shorewood Public Library. Music on this episode is by Kevin MacLeod. The song is called Ice Flow and can be found at incompetech.com.